That was practice. Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. First, I want to thank all the panel, the witnesses that have come to the committee, because today our subcommittee is holding its fourth hearings in a series on the impacts of oil and gas development, with this afternoon's focus on climate change and on public health. Under Committee Rule 4F, any opening oral statements are limited to the chair and to the ranking minority member or their designee. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. First, I'd like to welcome, as I said just before, our witnesses, and particularly thank those of you who traveled great distances to be here today. The committee has held several hearings in February on the impact climate change is having on America's public lands, on water, on wildlife, and on its communities. However, one topic we did not consider was how federal fossil fuel production contributes to climate change. Last week, we discussed how federal coal is the source of 13% of our country's greenhouse gas pollution. And today, we're going to hear testimony on how oil and gas on public lands produces another 10% of all U.S. emissions. That's 23% just from fossil fuel production on public lands. While that production is local, typically in the Gulf of Mexico or in the mountains of the western part of the United States, the impacts are being felt by all Americans. For example, climate change pollution from Louisiana offshore oil production degrades air quality in cities like Atlanta or Los Angeles. Climate pollution from Colorado's natural gas extraction increases the range of insect-spread diseases in New England. And climate pollution from New Mexico's leaky infrastructure and gas flares intensify hurricanes that batter the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast. More than 70 medical and public health organizations recently issued a call to action, calling climate change, and I quote, the greatest public health challenge of the 21st century, unquote. For too long, the Department of the Interior has supported more oil and gas drilling, while scientists sound the alarm and tell us to reduce emissions. The last 4 years have been the 4 hottest years ever recorded. June of 2019 is now the hottest single month on record, a record that sadly will probably not last that long. During the Obama administration, the Interior Department balanced its stewardship responsibilities with the management of immense oil and gas reserves. The Bureau of Land Management developed rules to reduce methane emissions and to promote renewable energy. The U.S. Geological Survey led cutting-edge climate research and was free to use the term climate change. And the Fish and Wildlife Service took steps to protect species most at risk from drought and from wildfires. But in 2017, the Trump administration brought this progress to a grinding halt. Since then, the administration has championed a fossil fuel agenda and pumped millions of tons of additional emissions into the atmosphere. Interior has repealed oil and gas safeguards, opened sensitive lands to leasing, and suppressed climate science. Secretary Bernhardt admitted he doesn't lose sleep over the planet reaching the highest carbon dioxide levels in human history. Most people who accept the threat of climate change agree the Interior Department needs new leadership. But just as critical as the need for new leadership is the need for a new approach to our public lands. While staying on the current path is unsustainable, returning to the strategies of the past won't get the job done either. If we don't do something different, public lands and waters will continue to be part of the climate problem, not part of the solution. So how can the Interior Department look towards improving the future rather than repeating the mistakes of the past? By updating prices for public oil and gas resources to reflect the cost of climate damages, by prioritizing and rapidly expanding clean energy development out west and off our coasts, by protecting large areas of forests and grasslands and using their natural ability to store carbon for our benefit, and by supporting states, tribes, and local communities that will be impacted by a transition away from oil and gas extraction. Every day we fail to tackle climate change, we lock in more warming that will weaken our nation and does weaken our nation, and that undermines the health of our children and future generations. The time to act is now, and we can lead the way. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and now I recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, and I thank the witnesses for traveling and making time here today. My colleagues on the other side have called this hearing to discuss, quote, the impacts of business as usual on climate and public health, as this hearing is titled. My colleagues assert that the Trump administration is prioritizing oil and gas development at the expense of all activities on our federal lands, and doing so without regard for the principles of multiple use or environmental stewardship. However, these claims couldn't be further from the truth. The regulatory reforms championed by the Department of Interior in recent years have been a welcome change of course from the anti-energy policies of the previous administration. Business as usual in the Obama era resulted in the lowest number of active oil and gas leases since 1988, a 42% decrease in the leased acreage, and the oil and gas leasing process growing from 3 to 6 months to over 16 months on average. Business as usual resulted in a total of 265 million acres made off limits to mineral development entirely, locking up not only federal lands, but also nearby state and privately owned minerals, threatening the livelihoods of countless Americans. Finally, we know that business as usual under Obama included issuing preemptive vetoes of mining projects such as Pebble Mine in Alaska and Twin Metals in Minnesota, even before completing environmental review and before giving operators the opportunity to present their project plans. Thankfully, the current administration has left this form of business as usual in the past. This administration has taken multiple steps to improve the oil and gas leasing and permitting process, including allowing the states to regulate hydraulic fracturing, reducing the economic burden of regulations, including the 2016 methane rule, eliminating duplicative layers of environmental review, and taking steps to move regulatory decision makers closer to communities impacted by these decisions. The reforms of the Trump administration are anything but business as usual. They are a step in the right direction after 8 years of anti-energy policies. My colleagues claim that we need more federal mandates to regulate hydraulic fracturing and venting and flaring, and have suggested that perhaps we should just shut down oil and gas and coal leasing on federal lands, waters altogether. However, these policies fail to acknowledge that the U.S. is leading the way in voluntary carbon emissions reductions, and that conventional energy resources have played a significant role in a cleaner energy economy at home and abroad. In 2017, U.S. carbon emissions reached the lowest level since 1992, and per capita emissions reached the lowest level since 1950. In fact, emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide on federal lands have fallen significantly over the past 15 years. Driving these emission reductions are the voluntary actions taken by industry to improve efficiency through innovation and the growth in natural gas production enabled by fracturing. Eliminating fossil fuel production on federal lands, as my colleagues have proposed, will not lessen our need for these energy resources. In fact, such proposals will only increase our dependence on oil, LNG, and coal produced abroad, where environmental responsibility is not a top priority. Similarly, blocking pipeline construction in individual states will not decrease demand for affordable oil or natural gas in communities within those states. Environmental groups are doing everything they can to block pipeline construction, even though that we know pipelines have a 99% safety record, much safer than shipping LNG sourced from Russia and oil sourced from Saudi Arabia to the U.S. ports, not to mention our rail traffic here in the States. Instead of arguing to shut down federal energy production based on selective science, we should be working on to streamline regulations to promote domestic production and the construction of pipelines to safely transport oil and gas. Investing in domestic production is a responsible path forward to both achieving energy independence and reducing emissions. We have the ability to take advantage of our abundant federal mineral estate to provide jobs and reliable energy for our communities rather than increasing demand in the U.S. and nations that rely on U.S.-sourced energy for dirty fuels produced in Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. Together with innovation in drilling and carbon capture technology, the U.S. can maintain a robust energy sector while continuing to reduce emissions. And with that, I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Now I have to go back. Thank you, Ranking Member Gosar. And I will now introduce our today's witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. David Hayes, the Executive Director of the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at the NYU School of Law. Mr. Hayes also served as Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer at the Department of the Interior for President Clinton and President Obama, and as a counselor to former Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt. Our second witness is Mr. Jamie Williams, the President of the Wilderness Society. Our third witness is Mr. Nicholas Loris, the Deputy Director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. And our final witness is Dr. Seth Shankoff, the Executive Director of the PSE Healthy Energy and a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. Let me remind the witnesses that they must limit their oral testimony to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please complete the statement. I'm also going to allow the full panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hayes to testify. Welcome, Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee. As you noted, my name is David Hayes. I'm the former Deputy Secretary of the Department of the Interior. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on climate change, our public lands, and oil and gas development. Several key observations guide my testimony. I begin with the observation that, in my opinion, the climate crisis presents the most significant challenge that our government has ever faced as trustee to our natural resources. Damage from climate change to our natural resources already is widespread and serious, and is only going to get worse. The evidence of climate change-induced damage to our public lands, as well as state and private lands, is right in front of our eyes. Prolonged droughts are stressing water supplies throughout the West. Precipitation falling as rain rather than snow has increased flooding and reduced snowpack. Tree-killing beetles are flourishing through warm winters, wiping out millions of acres of forest lands. Longer fire seasons combined with drier and hotter conditions are fueling historically destructive wildfires, and the list goes on. Accordingly, I believe that it is both unlawful and irresponsible to adopt a business-as-usual approach to managing our public lands in the face of climate change. As I detail in my written testimony, federal officials cannot comply with their congressionally mandated responsibilities to, quote, manage public lands to serve the, quote, long-term needs of future generations, and to, quote, prevent unnecessary or undue degradation, end quote, without forthrightly addressing climate impacts on public lands. In terms of what should be on the climate agenda for our public lands, I urge the Congress to instruct the Interior Department and other relevant agencies to respond to climate change by prioritizing, first, the development of practical, science-guided adaptation strategies, and second, the deployment of carbon management strategies that will lessen climate damage on all of our lands and resources. With regard to identifying strategies to adapt to climate impacts, our federal land, water, and wildlife managers need the benefit of the best science available to assess resource vulnerabilities and to shape sound adaptive management strategies. Top scientists at the Interior Department, the Department of Agriculture, NOAA, and NASA should be mobilized to do this important work and to broadly share their results. Thankfully, the Congress provided some ongoing support to the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers and Interior's landscape conservation cooperatives that have the potential to effectively translate scientific information into effective adaptation strategies for federal and non-federal land, water, and wildlife managers. To say the least, however, the administration has not been enthusiastic or particularly supportive about acknowledging or addressing the serious adaptation challenges facing our public lands. That needs to change. I also believe it's vitally important that our nation's land management agencies deploy carbon management strategies to address the climate crisis. I suggest 3 initiatives in particular. First, Congress should require the administration to develop and implement a national plan to enhance biological carbon sequestration on our public lands. Under the Energy Policy Act of 2005, Congress funded the work which proves this point. It's time to apply that learning on the ground. Second, Congress should direct the Interior Department to prioritize the siting of clean energy projects on public lands. The previous administration showed that clean energy projects can be sited in the right places and in the right way on our public lands. Unfortunately, however, the current administration has deprioritized clean energy in favor of fossil fuel development. That needs to be changed. Third, Congress should call on the Interior Department to put in place a sensible and a sustainable federal oil and gas drilling program on our public lands. Several elements are essential to such a program. First, we should not be drilling for oil and gas in America's special places. Second, the federal government should not be giving away the oil and gas resources on our public lands. As detailed in my written testimony, the administration is virtually gifting valuable taxpayer-owned oil and gas resources to the industry. And thirdly, as a part of a third leg for sustainable, the third leg is a sensible and sustainable federal oil and gas drilling program on our public lands, which should require operators to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from their operations and fully account for and report on the quantum of direct and indirect carbon pollution associated with oil and gas drilling. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. The chair now recognizes Mr. Williams to testify. Welcome, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, members of the subcommittee. Again, my name is Jamie Williams. I am president of the Wilderness Society, and I really appreciate this opportunity to testify. For more than 80 years, the Wilderness Society has been working with communities to protect our wild public lands. These are our national parks, our national forests, our wilderness areas, spectacular places that have defined who we are as a country and are so core to our health and well-being. These are the places that are so critical to the clean air that we breathe, the clean water that we drink, and these places reflect deep cultural ties for past, present, and future generations. Now, many people think that just because our public lands are public, they are protected, but that is in fact not the case. In fact, the majority of our public lands are managed for multiple use and the site for extensive mining and oil and gas development. In fact, for less than the price of a cup of coffee, developers can lock up major cherished outdoor recreation areas and wildlife habitat for decades to come. So it follows then that by 2017, our federal lands and waters were fully the source of more than 42% of the coal produced in this country, 24% of the oil produced in this country, and 13% of the natural gas produced in this country. That means that our public lands are a major part of the climate emissions in this country. To put that in context, if our public lands and waters were considered their own country, they'd be the 5th largest source of carbon emissions in the entire world. Meanwhile, our public lands and the communities who depend on them are at the very forefront of the impacts from climate change, as we're seeing melting tundra and glaciers in the Northwest and in Alaska and the Arctic, as we're seeing catastrophic wildfires across the West and California, and as we've seen devastating flooding in the Midwest and across the eastern seaboard. Now, under this administration's energy dominance agenda, things have actually gotten much worse. This administration has launched the largest rollback of conservation protections in the history of this country, stripping away critical safeguards for the environment and public safety, all in the name of eliminating impediments to fossil fuel leasing. They have deliberately hidden the climate impact of energy leasing, offering more land for lease than any administration in history. As detailed in a report that we are releasing today, the projected emissions just from the leases that have been sold by the Trump administration in the last 2 years would equal the total annual combined emissions of all 28 countries in the European Union. So at the very moment we should be pumping the brakes on carbon emissions, the Trump administration is stepping on the gas and accelerating the climate crisis. Today, the management of our public lands is actually a big part of the problem, but it can and it should be a big part of the solution. Of all places, we should be leading the changes that we need on the public lands that you and I own. How are we going to do this? First, our public lands provide the best opportunity to conserve large networks of lands to allow plants and animals to migrate to suitable habitat in a warming world. Second, we can put people to work conserving and restoring our lands to enhance their remarkable carbon storage capacity and also to increase the resiliency of our communities. Third, we can dramatically increase renewable clean energy on these lands. And finally, our public lands must lead our national efforts to reduce carbon emissions. To this end, we must eliminate subsidies for fossil fuel development. We need to stop permitting needless methane waste and pollution, and we must stop recklessly leasing without considering the consequences on our climate. In short, we need a climate plan for our public lands. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and we look forward to working with you on the solution to this critical crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Chair now recognizes Mr. Loris for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the impact of oil and gas development on climate change. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. America is an energy powerhouse. Domestic oil production is more than double where it was a decade ago, and last year the United States produced more natural gas than the entire Middle East combined. The result has been lower energy bills for hardworking American families and businesses across the country. We should celebrate this feat, not demonize it. The economic benefits of America's energy renaissance are significant and widespread, while the climate impacts are negligible. In this regard, I'd like to make 3 brief observations. First, energy is a key building block for economic prosperity and higher standards of living. When Americans pay more for electricity and gasoline, less money is available to spend on healthcare, clothes, food, and other necessities. And pricier energy disproportionately harms low-income families who spend a higher percentage of their budget on energy costs. Moreover, affordable, reliable power saves lives. A recent National Bureau of Economic Research paper concluded that the drop in natural gas prices driven by the shale boom averts 11,000 winter deaths per year due to cheaper heating costs. On a broader scale, expanding access to America's wealth of resources will create jobs and grow the economy. Using the U.S. Energy Information Administration's energy model, our analysis shows that lifting burdensome regulations on energy development will increase employment by an average of 700,000 jobs through 2035. Opening access and right-sizing regulations will spur new investment, generating $2 trillion in GDP over the same time period, which equates to an additional $40,000 of income per family of 4. My second observation is that no matter where one stands on the urgency to combat climate change, prohibiting oil and natural gas production on federal lands is an ineffective policy instrument. Emissions numbers by themselves do not provide policymakers with the relevant knowledge to inform decision-making with regard to energy development's impact on climate. A more useful tool to measure the climate effects is the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas-induced climate change. Developed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, this MAGIC model quantifies the temperature effect and sea level changes from increases and decreases in greenhouse gas trajectories. Running this model using the upper bound climate sensitivity projection from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we estimate that eliminating coal, oil, and natural gas production on federal lands would result in only 0.08 of a degree Celsius of averted warming by the year 2100. Similarly, increasing oil and gas development on public lands would have almost no climate impact. Running a high resource production scenario on public lands that increases carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions would increase global temperatures by a mere 0.03 of a degree Celsius by the turn of the century. Importantly, these estimates do not take into account the emissions leakage that will inevitably occur if the federal government were to curtail or prohibit natural resource extraction on federal lands. Policies that limit domestic energy production will not stop the consumption of these fuel resources, but instead shift production to places where the environmental standards are not as rigorous. My third observation is that the social cost of carbon models the federal government relies on to estimate the climate costs of fossil fuel production on federal lands are not credible because they rely on arbitrary and subjective assumptions. The social cost of carbon is defined as the monetary damages caused by an incremental increase in carbon dioxide in a given year. The federal government uses that figure to justify the alleged climate benefit of regulations or to inflate the alleged climate cost for natural resource development. The change in values of the social cost of carbon when subjecting these integrated assessment models to reasonable alternative inputs, such as changes to the discount rate and changes to how a doubling of atmospheric CO2 concentration influences warming, demonstrate just how disparate those social cost estimates can be. In fact, rerunning these models with a higher discount rate and lower equilibrium climate sensitivity found in peer-reviewed climate literature decreases the social cost of carbon figure by nearly 200%. There are even instances where the value has a high probability of being negative, meaning there is a social benefit to increased CO2 emissions. Yet another problem with these models is that they attempt to forecast economic damages out to the year 2300. Modeling costs centuries into the future considerably strains the credibility of these estimates. And while cost-benefit analysis is a critical tool for regulatory rulemaking, these integrated assessment models are unreliable, and policymakers would be wise to prohibit their use. In conclusion, prohibiting energy development on federal lands will increase prices, destroy jobs, and stunt economic growth, all for no discernible impact on climate. Instead, policy reform should open access to our abundance of resources, including renewable resources, empower states to have the regulatory authority over energy production within their respective borders, and establish a framework for competitive markets to respond to price signals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Loris. The chair now recognizes Dr. Shankov for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to appear before you today. By way of background, I'm an environmental public health scientist and the executive director of PSE Healthy Energy, a multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, nonprofit research institute that studies the way energy production and use impacts public health and the environment. I also hold formal research affiliations at the University of California at Berkeley and at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. My testimony is based on a strong body of science supported by decades of peer-reviewed research on climate change and about a decade of peer-reviewed research on the health dimensions of oil and gas development. Oil and natural gas are fossil fuels that pose well-understood risks to the climate. There is a strong scientific consensus that we are in a climate emergency and only have a limited period of time to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions to avert significant economic, health, security, and ecological consequences. I'm in front of you today as a scientist, but also as a father with an interest in protecting the health, security, and livelihoods of my children. In 2016, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management began down an emissions reduction path when it adopted a rule entitled Waste Prevention Production Subject to Royalties and Resource Conservation. The stated purpose of this rule was to reduce emissions of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, and health-damaging volatile organic compounds that are co-emitted with methane during oil and gas development and negatively impact local and regional air quality and public health. These volatile organic compounds include benzene, a known human carcinogen. During the first year of implementation, the repair of leaks and control of vapor from storage tanks would have reduced emissions of methane by more than half and health-damaging volatile organic compounds by approximately 70%. According to the Federal Register, these changes required would have reduced profit by the oil and gas industry by 0.15%. However, in March 2017, President Trump issued Executive Order 13783, which initiated the process of largely rescinding the BLM rule, and in September 2018, virtually all portions of the BLM rule were rescinded. In addition to well-documented climate risks due to the emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, oil and gas poses direct hazards, risks, and impacts to human health, largely through exposures to chemicals and other stressors that are accidentally and intentionally released to water, air, and soil. An evaluation of the peer-reviewed literature on air, water, and human health impacts of shale gas development concluded that 87% of air quality studies indicated impacts to air quality, 69% of water quality studies found associations with water quality impairment, and 84% of public health studies reviewed indicated public health hazards, risks, and adverse health outcomes. The majority of peer-reviewed studies on air quality and human health near oil and gas development have concluded that oil and gas emissions of health-damaging air pollutants tend to be more concentrated near oil and gas development infrastructure than further away. Studies suggest that health impacts such as poor birth outcomes and respiratory symptoms also tend to be more prevalent near oil and gas development than further away and compared with controls. In a peer-reviewed study I published with my colleagues, we found that 17.6 million Americans live within 1 mile of an active oil or gas well. While it is true that there are some unanswered questions regarding the exact mechanisms of health impacts of oil and gas development and climate change, there is clearly enough evidence for decision makers to take the following actions. Number one, immediately re-implement the cost-effective approaches to methane and health-damaging volatile organic compound emission control, as was required under the now rescinded 2016 BLM methane rule. And number two, implement increased minimum distances between where oil and gas development occurs and where people live, work, recreate, and play to protect public health. This testimony has been provided to inform the subcommittee of the need for increased regulation of oil and gas development at the federal and state lands, including on public lands. Again, I wish to thank the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak on the issue of the human health dimensions of oil and gas development and climate change. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shankov. And I want to thank all the panel for their testimony. I want to remind members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. My first questions are going to go to Mr. Hayes and Mr. Williams. You both really talked about some of the impacts of climate change upon, so my question is, I want to really explore what are the range of options that we have to really reducing some of the impacts of fossil fuel and fossil fuel pollution. And so the first question I have is that some environmentalists, some elected officials, and now some presidential candidates have called for the immediate end of fossil fuel production on public lands and in federal waters. You know, this is better known as keeping it in the ground. Is this a good place to start in terms of as we move forward, or not? And explain why this approach works or doesn't work to begin with, right at the beginning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that's not a good way to go. The reality is that we have a lot of infrastructure on our public lands to produce oil and gas. It's providing an important contribution to our economy. The issue is not so much the fact that that we have, and I think good points have been made that if there were not oil and gas drilling on our public lands, we'd get oil and gas from somewhere else. This is not the majority of the oil and gas provided by in the United States. But what we should be doing as a federal government on our public lands is doing this smartly and recognizing that there is a cost to the fossil fuel development on our public lands. We should be leading as a federal government, as a Congress, representing all American taxpayers to make sure that when federal oil and gas development is happening, it's happening in the right way, in the right places. Emissions are reduced to the maximum extent possible, which is why it's very unfortunate, in my view, that the Trump administration has trying to repeal the venting and flaring, is trying to stop the Clean Air Act application to methane under the through the Environmental Protection Agency, et cetera. The other piece of it is, on the optimistic side, the public lands have the potential to be a huge carbon sink and to help offset the greenhouse gas emissions from activities on public lands. We have not been paying attention to that. We have neither been measuring the positives in terms of biological carbon sequestration, nor have we been measuring the negatives in terms of the greenhouse gases that are coming out of federal production. I think that the opportunity for this Congress is to potentially say to the American people, we want our public lands to be net zero when it comes to greenhouse gases, and that is to take advantage of the positives, both the biological sequestration and new siting of clean energy on our public lands, and the negatives, those greenhouse gas emissions that need to be accounted for.
Mr. Williams, do you have anything to add? What do you think about starting with kind of a command and control, keep it in the ground? Is that the place we should start?
Mr. Chairman, I think that we need a comprehensive solution, and that absolutely we should be, and science is telling us that we need to aggressively rein in leasing. At the same time, we've got to address the leasing that has already occurred. The methane emissions coming from existing oil and gas is, as you know, 86 times more potent than carbon as a climate pollutant. So reinstating controls on methane venting and flaring, like the 2016 rule, where there are economically feasible ways to dramatically reduce methane release, is critical. And yes, I agree with Mr. Hayes that we also need to aggressively ramp up renewable energy as we do this, and to enhance the carbon.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the both of you quickly to kind of answer one question. Last week, Harvard economist Dr. Stock testified that incorporating a carbon adder on each ton of federal coal would be a practical way to account for climate impacts from coal production. Do you think we need a similar charge on oil and gas extracted from public land so that the prices of these fossil fuels reflects also their contribution to climate change? Quickly, yes or no?
I do. In fact, I co-authored the New York Times editorial op-ed that with James Stock on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Yes.
Thank you. With that, I yield back and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. Mr. Westerman, welcome. It's always good to see you at the committee.
Always good to be here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses. I was taking notes and doing some additional research even as you all were talking. I found it interesting, some of the discussions that were going on. Mr. Hayes, you talked about a 3-point plan to enhance plan for biological sequestration. I couldn't agree with that more. Site clean energy projects on public lands, agree with that, and sensible and sustainable drilling program, all good points. And there's something I think we forget in the discussion here, and Mr. Williams, you talked about how management of public lands is a big part of the problem, and I agree, it is a big part of the problem. But you attributed most of that problem to the climate impact of fossil fuels on federal lands. But I think we need to look at this idea of biological sequestration and just how much carbon is being released from federal lands in forest fires, and how much more carbon we could sequester on federal lands if we actually manage those lands with the best science when it comes to forestry. And I've got a trove of information here, some recent studies that were out, and this is an article from Time magazine that talks about planting 1 trillion trees may be the best way to fight climate change, the study says. And then if you go to the actual study that was done in Switzerland, it opens up saying the restoration of trees remains among the most effective strategies for climate change mitigation. In the Time article, it says, this by far, by thousands of times, the cheapest climate change solution and the most effective, said study co-author Thomas Crother, a climate change ecologist at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And then I also want to, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit these to the record without objection.
Without objection.
And then I'd like to go back to this 2014 article from the Journal of Sustainable Forestry. It's titled Carbon, Fossil Fuel, and Biodiversity Mitigation with Wood and Forest. This was written by Chad Oliver, a professor at Yale. And he looked at 2 different forest conservation approaches. Number one is to approach, the first approach is to minimize harvest and thus store CO2 in the forest and protect biodiversity through forest preservation. Number 2 is the approach is to use solid wood products and wood energy that avoid CO2 emissions from substitute materials and to maintain biodiversity through active management. You can read the paper, but his conclusion was by far that to actively manage our forest and use wood products and biomass for fuel is a much better climate solution. So I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on the important role of not just forest, but forest management, because we know that some of our states right now are net emitters of carbon off of their forest versus actually carbon sequestration. Mr. Hayes, you're nodding your head. Would you like to, you mentioned the enhanced plan for biological sequestration.
Congressman, I think your points are very well taken. The forest management is really an important piece of the puzzle here. We have not been spending enough science money on helping to measure carbon sequestration in forests. Under the Energy Policy Act of 2005, the USGS, over about a 6-year period, including a period when I was Deputy Secretary, did a comprehensive analysis of carbon sequestration from every land type in the United States and every region of the United States. We have very good science available, but it's not, the next step is to take that to the management. So how do we manage toward the most effective land types that can sequester the most carbon?
What we've been seeing is when management tries to get implemented on federal lands, it often hits roadblocks in the federal court system. I know in that article it said that those 1 trillion trees would offset the past 25 years of global carbon emissions.
The danger that we've seen is that in the past, under the salvage rider in the 90s, for example, that a slash and burn or a clear-cut approach or a non-scientific approach to the management of our forests is a negative. And potentially too much burning of biomass can be a negative as well. So it's got to be done carefully and scientifically, but we need to have more attention to this, and I really appreciate and honor your interest in the subject.
And we're already planting 1.6 billion trees per year in the United States. So that would be a stretch to get to a lot more, but we've certainly got some marginal lands that could be reforested. And I hope we'll start focusing on that side of the equation on public lands a lot more in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. I now recognize Representative Huffman for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Westerman's Yale bias is showing once again. He's introducing Yale studies into the record, but those were actually very thoughtful comments, and I find myself very interested in working with him on a lot of that, certainly reducing catastrophic wildfires and afforestation. Those are great tools. I'm less optimistic about biomass to energy, but maybe there's some innovation that can be part of the solution. So thank you for that. Mr. Loris, I was listening to your testimony and your basic premise that if we were to eliminate all of the emissions from our public lands, it still doesn't rise to the level of enough global temperature reduction to be worth our while. And I've got a real problem with that. I was trying to think of a way to articulate it. And here we are, it's the middle of summer. A lot of our kids are off at summer camp. Some of us have been campers or even camp counselors. And so just imagine, if you will, for a minute, you're a camp counselor, and you got 100 kids peeing in the pool. You could say it's hopeless and do nothing. Or you could start pulling them out one at a time. And in this case, we got a really big kid who was like drinking a couple big gulps before he got in the pool. So I'm not going to go too much further with that metaphor because it's fraught. But I can't accept the logic that unless you can identify individual solutions that rise to some level of significance on global temperature reduction, that you have to continue doing nothing. That's a recipe for the status quo. And in this case, we know that's, in fact, a recipe for disaster. Mr. Hayes, it's refreshing to have you back in the committee. I'm a little nostalgic about having you here because I remember a time when the Interior Department was not filled with folks who were simply rubber stamps for the oil and gas and coal industry. Thanks for your service. And I will note on the methane impact of natural gas, which I'm really concerned about. I feel like we are being sold a bill of goods when we're told that natural gas is a clean bridge fuel, that this is the answer to get rid of coal and switch to natural gas. The numbers tell a very different story. Your administration was at least taking some steps in the right direction of getting a handle on methane loss, but the Trump administration is taking us backward. And what's fascinating to me is that this is an administration who doesn't seem to care much about acts of Congress or even court orders when it wants to act, and yet when it comes to this, or any environmental protection, frankly, they say they need a very specific act of Congress and that they lack legal authority to do something about methane loss. Would you speak to the validity of that claim, because it doesn't hold water with me?
Nor with me, Mr. Congressman. The methane issue is, in my view, an outrage in terms of the administration's approach. The Mineral Leasing Act outlaws the waste of important natural resources. What's happening right now in terms of venting and flaring unwanted natural gas, because it's getting in the way of co-produced oil, it's being wasted, period, at huge cost to the climate. As Mr. Williams testified, 80 times the greenhouse gas power from methane. The Mineral Leasing Act is very clear. This administration has done everything it can to try to get rid of that regulation. It's in the courts right now. State attorneys generals are fighting it from progressive states.
Is there any question that this administration has legal authority to act on methane loss?
There is no question. There is no question. It's waste. They're it's venting it, they're flaring it as a waste product. Number two, the Clean Air Act, after the endangerment finding in 2009, finds that methane is causing harm to health and the environment, and the Environmental Protection Agency appropriately under the Clean Air Act, under Section 211, said this industry has to stop venting and leaking methane. It's trying to roll that back as well. The irony is that the large oil and gas companies understand the problem and are actually trying to address it, but this administration is trying to avoid it entirely and let that waste continue.
So one more question about this administration. In one of the more disturbing moments of the Natural Resources Committee, we had Interior Secretary David Bernhardt a few weeks ago, After trying to avoid answering questions about climate change repeatedly, he was finally put on the spot, and he said famously that he's not losing any sleep over climate change. You were the number 2 person in the Interior Department. Did you lose some sleep over climate change?
I lost some sleep, and that was before President Trump got started.
All right, thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. I now recognize Representative Lambourne for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm really glad you brought up that issue that you asked questions about, what some of the candidates for president are saying about their policy, leave it in the ground, or similar policies. And I'd like to refer you to a great op-ed that was in the Denver Post on Saturday, which I wrote, addressing this very same issue. So
See, we both think alike.
we're asking the same question, so maybe that's a little scary, I don't know. But thank you for having this hearing. And without going into detail, different ones have said that they want to, on the first day in office, they would say, let's have a moratorium on federal permitting for oil and gas offshore and onshore. Others have endorsed the Keep It in the Ground Act. Others have endorsed the Green Power Plan. I mean, there's a kind of a range, but there's some consensus among the candidates. And Mr. Hayes, you addressed that a few minutes ago. Mr. Loris, I'd like to ask you the same question that the chairman asked Mr. Hayes and Mr. Williams. What would be the policy ramifications if their wish came true? They took office in 2021 in January and started immediately enacting moratoria on public lands for fossil fuel production. What would happen to the country and the economy, and how much benefit would there be, if any, to the environment?
Yeah, and it's clear that if you're going to restrict supplies, that's going to drive up prices. And if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, if you look at public land production out west, that's simply going to drive up prices, which is going to directly and indirectly affect those jobs and industries associated with oil and gas production and with mining activities. But it's also going to have adverse impacts throughout the economy, because energy is such a critical component of everything we make and do. And so if you're raising energy prices on both the production side and the consumption side of the economy, that means businesses are going to pass those costs on to consumers, and consumers are going to see, they're going to buy less. And so overall, you have huge dead weight loss to the economy in terms of jobs lost and lost economic activity.
And would it do much for the environment?
It would not make any meaningful impact on climate change. And to Congressman Kaufman's point, that's not to say we shouldn't do anything, but I think if we return to the pool analogy, we've got bigger kids that are China and India that are peeing in the pool constantly, and they're tied down with anchors, and you're not going to be able to yank them up no matter what you do. And so we need to look to other policy alternatives that actually make meaningful impacts on climate, like Mr. Hayes suggested, with things like adaptation. And adaptation certainly isn't the only strategy, but let's look at cost-effective policies that actually make a difference in terms of protecting people from a changing climate.
Mr. Loris, if people have predicted, like I was looking at a Yale website, for instance, that if you go X number of increase in parts per million of carbon dioxide, you'll have a Y increase of global temperatures. Like from 400 to 500 parts per million, you'll have a 3 degrees Celsius rise of temperature in 50 years. Now, Yogi Berra said it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But given that there's a lot of uncertainties about the future, if that's the best projections we have, is it possible to take a specific plan someone is putting in black and white on paper and say this will have so much decrease of carbon emissions, therefore under these projections it'll have so much decrease of global temperatures? Is that a viable way of trying to impose some kind of metrics on these plans that are being put forward?
It's difficult to do because those projections are really all over the map. There's peer-reviewed literature that says the equilibrium climate sensitivity, which is essentially what is the temperature impact of a doubling of CO2 emission concentrations, is 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. There's other climate literature that says it's upwards of 4.5 to 5 degrees Celsius. And if you have that 4.5 to 5 degrees Celsius range, you get some pretty catastrophic scenarios. But if you have the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, those scenarios, those catastrophic scenarios, really go away.
But can you plug in the numbers and whichever scenario you use, if a plan has very modest decreases, it may sound good, but it has modest decreases, we can assume it'll have only a modest effect on the environment.
Yeah, in the 4.5 to 5 degrees Celsius range or in the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius range, because the overall emissions reductions are so small compared to the global pot of emissions, you know that the temperature reduction and the changes in sea levels are going to be negligible no matter what.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lamborn. I now recognize Representative DeGette for 5 minutes of
Thank you so
testimony.
much. Mr. Lamborn, I'm so happy to see of your keen interest in the Democratic primary election. Keep it up. Mr. Hayes, I wanted to ask you, would you say the Trump administration is working to expand the extraction of oil and gas from public lands and offshore?
Yes.
And Mr. Loris, would you agree with that?
Yes.
And Mr. Hayes, is the federal government required by law to promote the extraction of oil and gas as aggressively as it is?
No, it is not, and to the contrary, the Secretary of the Interior has discretion and should be using it to not expand more oil and gas development in places like the offshore Atlantic, offshore Pacific, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, areas that are protected for the greater sage grouse due to bipartisan conservation agreements across the western states, the critical environmental areas that are now being switched over to allow from protection to oil and gas drilling.
They're not required to do any of that.
They're not required to, and I would argue that you cannot apply the stewardship principles that are in the Federal Land Management Policy Act in a way that when there are already 30 million acres of undeveloped, already leased oil and gas lands on our public spaces, to be increasing into frontier areas with no infrastructure, with unproven reserves. Why are we doing that at giveaway prices?
Right, and I'm sure you know, Mr. Lamborn and I have been talking a lot about this. I have a bill to create 740,000 more acres of wilderness on BLM lands in Colorado. Some of them have existing oil and gas leases right now, which we grandfather in, but some of them have no leases at all. So as I hear what you're saying, and probably Mr. Williams, you would also agree with this, is there are areas that have leases right now. Eventually, we might want to withdraw those, but they have the leases right now. What you're saying is, why are you expanding into more areas when the leases that are there right now are not being fully utilized? Is that correct, Mr. Hayes?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Now, I wanted to ask, I don't know, and Mr. Williams, I'll ask you, because I thought what Mr. Westerman was saying was really interesting too, about carbon capture and planting more trees and so on. And I think that's a good idea, but could we reverse climate change solely by doing that? Or are there other steps we have to take as well to get to the goals we need?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. And natural solutions are important, and protecting.
But is it the only way?
No, absolutely not. It's not the only thing. So we've got.
Could we get to the goals we need to solely by the natural solutions? Yes or no will work?
No.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Hayes, is the Department of the Interior required to consider climate change in its decision-making?
I believe it is.
And aside from the fact that the president last week took credit for reducing carbon emissions, how would you characterize the Trump administration's actual actions to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions?
I don't think the administration has taken any positive action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Now, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, BP, Shell, and Total all are members of a coalition which called for a fee on carbon starting at $40 a ton and rising steadily over time. The revenue raised would go directly to the American public. And so I wanted to ask you, Mr. Williams, do you know of any sign that the President and Senate majority support a carbon fee and dividend as the oil companies are calling for, or any kind of carbon tax? Yeah, do you know, because this coalition of oil companies has called for a carbon tax, do you know if that's supported by the President or the Senate majority?
It is not.
Oh, okay. And Mr. Hayes, I want to stick with you. What do you think the Department of Interior should do in the meantime to address climate change before we do some kind of legislation?
I laid it out in my testimony, Congresswoman. Several things: reduce the emissions, do more biological sequestration, do not do more oil and drilling in frontier areas and environmentally sensitive areas, and move toward a net zero goal to offset emissions from oil and gas on public lands with offsets so that through our sound management of our public lands, we can show the way for reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the board.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the entire panel.
Thank you, Representative DeGette. I now recognize Representative Hearn for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Republican Leader Gosar, and our witnesses for being here today to testify on the oil and gas developments. As all you know, oil and gas are each essential to the American energy sector, and as they provide a reliable source of power and employment for thousands of Americans. In spite of this, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have continually opposed these developments as a part of their war on fossil fuels, and they have pushed an irresponsible agenda which would have devastating consequences to the energy sector. These efforts would do nothing more than stymie American domestic energy development to push energy production to countries with far less stringent regulations. Mr. Loris, through your work at the Heritage Foundations, you have proven to be an expert on these policies and their effect. You are also aware that despite some Democrat proposals to rapidly decrease fossil fuels use in the United States, the demand for conventional resources will continue to be needed into the foreseeable future. Can you please elaborate on the need for these conventional resources and the effects that limitations on oil and gas developments may have on our energy sector?
Yeah, if you look at most domestic projections of the future of conventional fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, both in the United States and around the world, they're going to dominate the energy pie for a very long time. The International Energy Agency projects that it may shift from about 80% of the world's energy needs being met by fossil fuels to about 77 to 76%. So they're around for the foreseeable future. And yes, we're seeing strides in the cost coming down on renewable power, and that's great. We want more competition in the energy sector, but these conventional fuels that provide affordable, reliable power aren't going away anytime soon, and that's why my concern for policies that restrict fossil fuel production on federal lands and in the United States generally are simply just going to increase prices for U.S. Families, for energy-consuming businesses. We've seen a lot of energy-intensive manufacturers come to the United States directly citing cheap energy as the reason why. That could simply go elsewhere.
Could you describe very long time? I mean, and quantify that in years? I mean, because right now we're talking about a Green New Deal to eliminate fossil fuels by 2030. Some of our colleagues across the aisle. What is a very long time?
Yeah, I mean, these projections by the IEA and by the EIA see, they project out to 2040 or so and still see fossil fuels being a large chunk of the energy pie.
So it's clear that our need for baseload power requires the use of oil and gas for the foreseeable future. And additionally, research shows that the U.S. is leading the way in voluntary carbon emissions reductions as our emissions per GDP has significantly declined over the past years. It's also my understanding that these reductions are largely driven by voluntary actions taken by industry to improve efficiency through innovation, and other nations have not had the same success in reducing emissions. I'd also say that free market, free enterprise, consumers wanting greener and more efficient has driven companies to produce more efficient generators, to scrub stacks better, to prevent runoffs more from coal stacks and other things like that. Is that how you would see it as well?
Yeah, I think it's been a combination of market factors, that cheap natural gas is overtaking coal as our primary electricity source generation. You're seeing, as I mentioned, the cost of renewables coming down. In states where you have competitive electricity markets, you have consumers who are demanding 100% renewable power, and so that's playing a role. And so I think if the consumers demand it and the industry is willing to meet that demand, you can see significant economic and environmental gains. Where we run into problems is when it's subsidized and mandated, because that's when you get the unintended environmental consequences and the direct economic consequences of losing out when it comes to conventional fuel production.
Because it would probably surprise people in this committee to know that when we think of green energy requirements or companies require, we think of Amazon and Google and people like that. It probably would surprise folks to know that Google's second largest server farm in the world is just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in an oil and gas driven state that drives 25% of the economy and millions of direct and indirect jobs. And they're requesting through technology to buy renewable energy credits on the grid allows a varied mix of energy to be supplied to drive their large Google. They're spending $600 million right now, expanding it even larger. So it's industry drives, and consumers drive, industry responds to what the needs are. Could you explain more in detail, and we're out of time, I really thank you for your responses. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Hearn.
Mr. Chairman, would you entertain a request to enter a couple things in the record?
Absolutely.
If we can have unanimous consent, just to the points that were raised by my friend across the aisle. A recent study, 2019 study by the Rhodium Group demonstrating that U.S. greenhouse gas emissions are actually rising again. So the victory lap from the Obama years is over. We're now not leading the world. And then a recent E&E news story confirming the same and actually projected continued increases next year.
Without objection. I now recognize Representative Cunningham and first thank him for those wonderful South Carolina peaches.
With pleasure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad you enjoyed them. Thank you all, everyone who's able to make it today, Mr. Hayes, Mr. Williams, Mr. Loris, and Dr. Shonkoff. Thank you for making it. Dr. Shonkoff, my question is for you. I understand that you were a contributing author to the IPCC chapter on human health impacts of climate change. So can you help explain some of the ways that my constituents, and I represent the 1st District of South Carolina, so the coastal area, basically from Charleston all the way down to Hilton Head. It's objectively the most beautiful district in the entire country. I think everyone in here would agree. And
Huffman is smiling.
Okay. That's in the record now, so it's official. And it's been one of the most pristine districts. We also have the most to lose with rising sea levels, climate change. So I was hoping you could discuss, what impacts my constituents and the people across South Carolina will see as temperatures continue to rise, and how these cities like Charleston should start planning for these future conditions.
Thank you, Congressman, for the good question. I come from what I believe to be the most beautiful place in our country.
We'll strike that from the record.
But in any case, South Carolina, you're right. South Carolina is particularly vulnerable, actually. In terms of sea level rise, South Carolina is burning the candle at both ends. You have some of the most rapid sea level rise in the country. You also have some pretty significant subsidence, which is essentially the ground is sinking, and that's happening for a variety of reasons, including pumping of groundwater. You have sinking land and rising seas, and you can see how this is a pretty serious situation, and you're going to have to prepare for that. We all remember your hurricane in 2018, and climate change is expected to increase the intensity and frequency of such large events. In addition to all of the things that we normally think about with hurricanes, damage to property, displacement of people, danger of flash floods, the leftovers from these major weather events paired with rising temperatures can also lead to a proliferation of habitat for various vectors such as mosquitoes that can carry a number of life-altering diseases such as the Zika virus. These are things that are probably coming down the pike, and there are ways that we can reduce the risks of those things. We've been talking about a variety of proposals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. And in terms of preparing, a lot of it's going to come down to adaptation. A lot of it's going to come down to investing the resources in hardening your coastline. It's going to come down to developing buildings and other structures that are basically are able to absorb the issue with rising risk of floods and probably a lot of mosquito abatement in the coming years. Unfortunately, I believe that it's probably time to start thinking before it really happens, start thinking about a managed retreat plan because the sea level rise certainly is coming.
I appreciate your testimony, and I will cede the rest of my time to my colleague from California, Mr. Huffman.
Thank the gentleman from the beautiful district in South Carolina. And Mr. Shankop, while we're talking about public health impacts, we were discussing natural gas a minute ago and the challenges with methane losses. We know that methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, but there's other health effects to methane, right? And so ground level ozone, the totality of it all would suggest to me that this is really not the clean, benign solution to climate change that some people would like us to believe. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, and thank you for the question, Congressman. Methane in and of itself is actually an inert gas. It's known to be virtually non-toxic. That said, from oil and gas, natural gas itself is not pure methane. Natural gas itself is co-mingled with and co-emits a variety of health-damaging air pollutants. We know a lot about these air pollutants. We have standards for exposure to these air pollutants, such as benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, the BTEX group, among other compounds. You're right to bring up the issue of ground level ozone. Methane contributes to the proliferation of background global ozone concentrations, which does and will continue to complicate regions' ability to meet the national ambient air quality standards. So from a climate perspective, methane, as you said, is a strong greenhouse gas, 86 times as strong as CO2 over the 20-year time horizon. And even though it is of itself an inert gas, it is always there are always co-emissions of other health-damaging species along with it.
Thank you, Dr. Yieldback.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, we hear a lot from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that our lands are being given away to oil companies and that this administration is eroding the principles of multiple use. However, as highlighted in an article last night in the Wall Street Journal, most of our federal lands and waters are still off limits to production. In fact, 94% of the outer continental shelf remains off limits. The article also points out that even though the U.S. now is a net exporter, we are still importing over 6 million barrels a day, mostly from Saudi Arabia and other nations whose production processes are far dirtier and less safe. I'd like to submit this article for the record.
Without objection.
This isn't to mention that elimination of the outer continental shelf would eliminate the dollars that we use for land and water conservation acquisitions. Mr. Loris, China and India produce the greatest amount of emissions in the world, and without a major geopolitical shift, it seems safe to assume their energy use patterns will continue for the foreseeable future. Given the continued demand for coal, oil, and gas, is there any reason why the U.S. shouldn't meet the demand? And arguably, wouldn't greater amounts of American energy exports actually improve global emissions given our superior environmental standards?
Yeah, we should. If you look at what China and India and most of the developing world submitted in terms of their nationally determined contributions to meet the Paris Protocol, they're largely business as usual cases. In some instances, they're even less than the business as usual, so they can continue as business as usual to make it look like they're actually doing something on climate change. So if they're going to continue to demand and need a lot more energy, we should be a critical part of that supplier through liquefied natural gas, through exporting our renewable energy technologies, through exporting nuclear technologies. There's a lot we have to offer, both in terms of the physical energy resource itself, but also our leader as a technological advancer of these technologies.
Now, some of the witnesses today discussed methane emissions from natural gas pipelines. Interestingly enough, NOAA recently reported that many reports on methane have overestimated emissions by 10 times because they erroneously track ethane, which gave the false impression of higher methane emissions. In fact, while natural gas production has increased 46% since 2006, methane emissions have only slightly increased. I would like to submit for the record, this research for the record. I guess even so ordered.
So ordered.
Even so, we know that venting and flaring is often necessary when pipeline capacity is limited and the location of pipelines. To your knowledge, what could be done to decrease the need for venting and flaring of methane?
Well, I think you just mentioned it. Part of it is infrastructure. If it's economically efficient to capture that resource and deliver it to where it has economic value, we shouldn't have natural gas pipelines and other energy infrastructure be needlessly held up in terms of long environmental review and permitting processes or just seemingly endless litigation. And we also need to look at some of the innovation that's occurring. If you look at some of the crypto miners, the cryptocurrency miners, they are locating their mining activities right now to places like the Bakken and the Permian because they see that methane as a valuable energy source to help with their crypto mining. And then also state regulation needs to be a part of the solution as well. As former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson said, it doesn't need to be the federal government implementing all of these regulations. The states are stepping up and doing a good job.
I'm limited at time, so I'd also like to bring up Petronova. You know, here's a technology where in Houston what they're capturing is all the greenhouse gases off of the coal plant, sending them through a pipeline, vesting them into the subsurface where they've actually fracked, pushing out the oil and gas, and then condensing these into the subsurface. So pretty interesting. Now, you're familiar with a Michael Schellenberger, are you not, Mr. Loris? Mm-hmm. You know, interesting, tomorrow we're actually talking about negative effects of actually withdrawing uranium, which is one of the cleanest aspects. Would you agree?
I would.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Hayes, we all remember your emails to Mr. John Podesta regarding drilling offshore Alaska. As I recall, the administration made the regulatory process so cumbersome and expensive for Shale, including shortening the drilling season and stymieing exploration by only allowing them to drill one well. That Shell ultimately decided to cut their losses after spending $7 billion in regulatory compliance. But it turns out that was the plan all along. You congratulated Mr. Podesta on the failure of the Shell project and discussed your plan to end all offshore drilling in the Arctic. That doesn't appear to be consistent with the multiple use at all, does it? Rather, it was yet another example of predetermined outcomes engineered to the manipulation of the regulatory process, just as we saw at the Pebble Mine and Twin Metals. But I suppose that was business as usual during your tenure at Interior. I would like to submit for the record, American Energy Alliance on this email correspondence for the record.
So ordered.
May I respond?
Mr. Hayes, I didn't ask a question.
Okay.
Mr. Hayes, Mr. Westerman made the comment about species, but it's also the type of species, right? Young, medium, and old growth trees have a very different prospect, don't they?
Yes, they do.
And so part of our catastrophic fire aspect has been the implication of where we have not managed our forest properly, true?
I'm sorry.
part of the problem that we've had with our national forests has been the improper management of our forests, true?
That's a very broad question. It's too
No,
broad.
I would send it.
With your indulgence, can I respond to the
Well,
tirade?
this is my time. This is my time.
Okay, thank
I
you.
control it. And so when you start looking at young and medium growth trees, they produce more oxygen than they do carbon. But old growth trees produce more carbon. They go into carbon debt. Is that true?
I believe so, but I believe neither
Yeah,
you
so let
nor
me
I
ask-
are a scientist.
So let me ask you another question.
Mr. Chairman, I love Mr. Gosar, but we're a minute and a half past his
apologize.
time, and the
Well-
witness is not being allowed to answer the questions that are being...
Conversation went well over.
Well, I let your, went over
Okay.
by a minute, so I allowed this one.
I was just going to ask, as a point of procedure, if there'll be some closing opportunity for Mr. Hayes to respond, because he was just leveled.
I'm going to ask them all to respond, if there's some question that they feel.
Perfect, thank you.
Those members that want to stay, we're going to start a second round of talk. So I'm going to recognize Representative Cunningham for 5 minutes, hopefully shorter.
Okay, hopefully shorter. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks again to the panel, specifically Mr. Hayes. I'll give you a chance to give you a little bit of time so you can respond to Mr. Gosar, because I think that there's a number thrown around that says 94% of the lands offshore are basically off limits for offshore drilling. And I don't know where those numbers came from. I'd be interested to look at the record. But I can tell you that off the coast of Folly Beach, 100% of those lands are on the chopping block for offshore drilling. Off the coast of Sullivan's Island, 100% of those areas are exposed to offshore drilling. Hilton Head, the same. Kiowa, the same, 100%. So all the way down the coastline of South Carolina, we're exposed right now to offshore drilling. And so that's why I wanted to ask you a question, give you a little bit of time to respond to the prior matter if you'd like. I understand you're a deputy secretary between 2009, 2013, and that you're involved with offshore leasing decisions, including the development of the Interior Department's 2012 to 2017 offshore oil and gas leasing program. Thankfully, this plan did not expose South Carolina and my constituents to the risk of oil and gas drilling. Mr. Hayes, can you discuss why the Obama administration did not go forward with drilling in the Atlantic, and whether you believe that the current efforts by the Trump administration to open South Carolina's coast to leasing would be worth the risk?
I can, Mr. Congressman. When we came into the administration in January 2009, the Bush administration had put on the table opening up the entirety of the Mid-Atlantic and the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic, I believe, as well as the Pacific Coast to oil and gas drilling, just as the Trump administration has done. We followed the strictures of the Outer Continental Land Shelf Act. We talked to all the states involved. We had public hearings around the country. We applied the statute, which looks at, is there gas infrastructure? Is there gas resources? What do the states think? Et cetera, et cetera. We made a decision to not allow for oil and gas drilling out offshore of your state and the Atlantic, nor more oil and gas drilling in California. Obviously, the Trump administration put it all back on the table again. I do not understand why they are continuing to leave it dangling when I think a straightforward reading of the statute, given the input that they have gotten from your state on a bipartisan basis, for example, there is no interest, and there's no infrastructure, and there's no proven reserve. Why is that open? I don't understand, but I just explained what we did. And if I can, with regard to Alaska, I know a little bit about offshore drilling. I also was the first administration official down in the Gulf of Mexico after the disaster on April 10th, 2010. With regard to Alaska, Marvin Odom, who is the president of Shell Oil Company, will confirm what I'm telling you, Ranking Congressman Gosar. There was a dry hole. We allowed them, even after the Gulf disaster, and given the tremendous risk associated with oil and gas drilling off the northwest coast of Alaska, where there's no infrastructure if there's a problem, we developed regulations to deal with that. Shell accepted them, moved forward, was able to drill. There was a dry hole. They gave up entirely and voluntarily all of their leases, which they had purchased for more than $1 billion. The regulatory system worked. They withdrew. No one is showing any more interest in that area. A combination of the remoteness, the lack of, and most importantly, the lack of a resource.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hayes. And thank you for pointing out that this is it sounds like you took into consideration what states actually want off their shoreline, right? And we have a Republican governor, Henry McMaster, who has been adamant that we don't want offshore drilling off the coast of South Carolina. It sounds like during your tenure, you took those remarks under consideration, right?
As required by law. It's one of the specific factors in the Offshore Leasing Act that is required to be taken into consideration by the Secretary of the Interior.
And you believe that states ought to have a say in what happens off their shorelines, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, and by yes or no, I want to go down the rest of the panel and ask you whether or not you believe that states should have a say in what happens off our shoreline. Mr. Williams, is that yes or no? Mr. Loris?
I think they should have complete control.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Shankle?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. I'm glad that's something we can all agree on. I appreciate your time again. Thank you. I would cede the rest of my time back to the chair.
Thank you. And I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
So, Mr. Hayes, I just want to make sure that this email thing with Mr. Podesta, that is real and true?
I don't know which email you're talking about. It's one of the ones that the Russians hacked, but I don't know which one you're talking about.
Shell's dry hole starts with? I just want to make sure that we're talking that...
I don't remember that email, sir.
Well, for the record, it is an email chain from you in regards to...
Well, it may well be. What I'm saying is the reality is there's a dry hole.
My point is that you made it very expensive for them to drill that hole, $7 billion. You know, so the regulatory hurdle, time is money as well. So my dad is also in the oil and gas business, so I do understand it quite well. So I got some other questions. So the resources off the Outer Continental Shelf, are they the resources of the American people or South Carolina?
They're the resources of the American people beyond the 3-mile
I agree.
area. Yes.
I just wanted to make sure. I want to make sure. Now, Mr. Loris, we heard testimony that we've seen the warmest years on record. And interestingly enough, this year in Arizona, we had the coldest May in recorded history. But you're familiar with statistics, are you not? How about you, Mr. Schoenhoff? You cited a number of statistics.
Familiar with statistics?
So when we say these are the warmest years, what was the statistical margin of error? Was it greater or less than actually the rise in the temperature? Yeah?
I don't know the answer to that question.
It was greater. So technically, if the research said it was 1.3% higher and the statistical margin of error is 1.9, it could have got colder, could it not?
If it said that, then I suppose it could have.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Loris?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when we start talking about, Mr. Loris, when we talk about methane, you know, we've seen a huge increase in the amount of methane, have we not?
A huge increase in the amount of?
No, a huge increase of oil and gas production. So I'm sorry.
Correct, yes.
And so we've only seen a slight increase in methane.
Correct.
And methane is a recoverable, has value?
Correct.
Okay. Just want to make sure I got that too. Mr. Hayes, 1 day of catastrophic fire is equal to how much emissions from cars in the United States?
I don't know, sir.
It's about 1 year is equal to 1 day. Catastrophic fires are even worse. Why? What do plants do to water? They filter it. So heavy metals, whatever they're around, trees have it. So what ends up happening when they burn, they explode it. So if there's...
I certainly stipulate that catastrophic fires are a very bad thing, including with regard to impacts on climate change.
Yeah. So if we're talking about status quo, and I do know that they put into the record greenhouse gases, but the lowest emissions are the quality of our energy products, are they not, Mr. Hayes? So like oil and gas, the way that we do it is much more efficient than China.
With regard to greenhouse gases, we don't have any emissions restrictions at all.
But I mean, it
on
doesn't
oil
matter
and-
restrictions. I mean, technology actually makes us better at it, does it?
Well, I don't think so, sir. There are no restrictions on.
Well, let me ask you a question. So who makes more? India, China, and the United States?
In terms of oil and gas, I'm
It's
hearing
carbon.
that, I'm hearing that
Greenhouse gases, that's all I'm asking. Greenhouse gases, who does more?
I believe China's ahead of us now.
And so is India. And so under the current agreement that was so put, they continue that process over and over and over and over again, don't they? The Paris Climate Accord? Yeah, they get a waiver.
We can talk about the pool that Congressman
So I
Hoffman talked
guess where I'm
about.
going with this is under One Belt, One Road, the influence of China around the world on infrastructure and minerals and energy is not very good, whereas what we produce is a much better scenario, is it not?
Well, not when we've withdrawn from the Paris Agreement and lost our ability to talk to China and to work together as an international community to deal with these issues.
I totally disagree with you, because what ends up happening, everybody wants cheap energy, and it's affordable from us. And wherever I go, whether it be at Vietnam, whether it be Lithuania, they all want our energy because it's cheap and it's clean. So it does make a lot of sense geopolitically to be able to do that. With that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Before I draw these, I'm going to conclude the questions from the panel, but before I conclude the hearing, I'd like to ask each of the panelists in maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes to respond. Either if you didn't get a chance to fully explain yourself or answer any questions, this is an opportunity, or was there some question that you would have liked to have been asked, that you weren't asked, that you can provide us also with an answer? So I'm going to start with Mr. Hayes. Either you add to some answer that you had before, or was there some critical issue that you'd like us to hear about, and maybe you might be able to answer that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's very gracious of you to provide that opportunity. I'd say the one point I would want to clarify is right at the outset of the hearing, I was asked about whether I agreed with keep it in the ground or not as a philosophy. And I said no, and what I meant was I do not believe that it's practical or appropriate to today stop oil and gas drilling on our public lands. I do think, as my colleague Mr. Williams said, we need a comprehensive approach to oil and gas drilling. We need to understand what the implications are. And right now, we need to stop moving and stop increasing the footprint of oil and gas drilling in the United States into areas like the coasts, like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, like the areas that have been dedicated to protect this greater sage grouse by bipartisan agreement across the West, et cetera, et cetera. There are tens of millions of acres already leased of public lands for oil and gas development that are lying idle. And now is the time. We're producing lots of oil and gas. A lot of it's on state land and private land. This is the time for the federal government to get its house in order and to evaluate what the impacts are of the greenhouse gases associated with the oil and gas operations, curb those emissions to the maximum extent possible, have the federal government be a true steward, and also look at the other side of the coin, how the public lands can help the equation by doing more clean energy projects that are responsive to what the customers are asking for right now, as we did in the Obama administration, and which has virtually stopped today, and by looking at the biological sequestration enhancement opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes, and I hope that you stay tuned to future hearings, because we're going to address that very issue that you're saying about what are the alternatives, and especially in terms of keep it in the ground, and where are we, and how do we reach our goal, and what do we mean by some kind of comprehensive plan that has accountability built into it. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question I would have liked is why we're not developing more well-sited renewable energy on our public lands. And right now, only 5% of the renewable energy in this country comes from our public lands. And the reason is because everything's tilted towards developing fossil fuels in our public lands. We subsidize it. We have green-lighted it in every regard, which is why this administration has leased more than 378 million acres for fossil fuels, while permitting virtually no renewable energy on public lands, a little bit offshore. So ultimately, our public lands have a big opportunity to be part of the climate solution with cost-effective strategies that will grow our economy in advancing renewable energy that are well-sited and in bringing forward a comprehensive solution as we transition to a clean energy economy in the future and as we manage our lands for the health of the planet and our communities.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. Loris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to refrain from jumping back into the peeing in the pool analogy and focus on something else. But to Congressman Cunningham's point about should states have a say in this matter, I think that needs to cut both ways. It really wasn't all that long ago in 2008 when both Democratic senators from Virginia, Congressman Warner and Senator Warner and Senator Kane, proposed drilling off the coast, the OCS in the Atlantic, stipulating they get 50% of the royalty revenue. So if we're going to give states more control, it needs to be both proactive in terms of allowing for access to that energy development, not just saying no. And I think the more that the states assume regulatory authority over the environmental review and permitting process, they should get an even greater share than that 50% royalty, because they can use that money for however they choose, whether it's adaptation, conservation, just to pump back into schools and hospitals. There's a lot of revenue at their disposal that they could use. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Shonkoff, what should we have asked, or would you have liked us, or is there something that you would like to complete one of the statements that you've made?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would have liked to have a question about the reuse of oil and gas wastewater for irrigation of food crops, recharging of aquifers, and discharge to waters of the U.S., and my thoughts about the public health considerations of these practices. Look, there's a big push going on from the oil and gas industry to open up new ways to handle and reuse their wastewater, which is of considerable volume. The fact of the matter is basically, first of all, this is a resource which could be used. There's nothing wrong with reusing water. That said, before we reuse emerging sources of water, such as oil and gas wastewater, we need to know what's in it, and we need to know how to monitor to make sure that it is acceptable for its use. And with that, I will end my comments.
Well, thank you all. And just as we conclude this hearing, the ranking member has one last final statement.
Yeah, all four members, I think, are endorsing our public lands renewable bill, yours and mine.
Yes.
Amazing about that. The only thing I would comment is Mr. Williams has got a comment in regards a hold on geothermal. So I want you to rethink that, okay? So just FYI.
Very close before Grace time.
Anyway, that was my comment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Graves, for coming just as we're concluding. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony. Would you like to make one last statement? Oh, just one question. Okay, go on.
Only just one question?
Well,
come on, Huffman.
Come on, we'll let you come. You've just gone through a lot in Louisiana, which we're not attributing it to climate change, but it's awfully wet.
That's right. Hey, thank you very much for being here. Mr. Hayes, I want to ask you a question. It's been interesting. We had a former Fish and Wildlife Service director in here a few months ago who was talking about how we shouldn't build border walls because it impacts the migration of birds, which I didn't fully understand, but because I thought birds flew over walls, but whatever. But the point is, under the Obama administration, there were more miles of walls built than there were built under the current administration. I see you come in. You're a previous Obama administration interior official, and you're basically saying that we need to stop producing energy to some degree, oil and gas. Am I misunderstanding that? So please.
Yes, you're misunderstanding that,
okay,
Congressman. Which I just clarified a few minutes ago, my belief is that it's impractical and inappropriate to stop oil and gas drilling on our public lands and offshore waters right now. However, I question, particularly given the the emissions associated with it, and also the availability, ready availability on other lands, why we are considering going into frontier areas like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, like offshore South Carolina, et cetera.
Okay, so you do believe that we should continue producing energy on public lands?
I do, but I think we need to get a handle on the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. We're not quantifying them. We're certainly not restricting the venting and flaring of very powerful methane, which I think is inexcusable. My testimony goes into this in some detail.
Sure. So there are things that we can be doing to improve sort of the efficiency or the environmental impacts of that production. Is that safe?
Absolutely. I think we need a comprehensive plan to deal with overall energy development on our lands with an eye toward climate change in particular.
Sure. I know in some of Mr. Loris's previous testimony that he gave last year, I think you talked a little bit about revenue sharing and Mineral Leasing Act as compared to Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. Mr. Hayes, do you have any thoughts on the treatment of revenues from onshore energy production under the Mineral Leasing Act versus offshore energy production under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act? Meaning, should states be for onshore production, states are allowed to share? Do you believe that states should receive a portion of the revenues from offshore energy production?
I don't think my views on that matter, Congressman. I'm in the Jeff Bingaman view of the world, that these are resources that are all Americans and that the revenues should be shared broadly, but I appreciate your point of view on this,
Sure.
and I know there have been compromises in the past with regard to that.
I've always enjoyed former Chairman Bingaman's perspective on that. While the state of New Mexico is receiving, I think it was like $300 million a year in revenue sharing. I always found that fascinating. Mr. Loris, previously I know you've talked a little bit about the disparity between revenue treatment from onshore energy production and offshore. Do you care to expand upon that?
Yeah, I believe that it should be the same, either 50-50 or, one policy proposal that I've championed is transitioning more of the environmental review and permitting processes to the states. And if they're going to bear that responsibility and also bear some of the risks that are associated with energy production, then they should get more of the benefit. So I would like to see more of that revenue accrued to the states, because I think it can be, one, it can incentivize good decisions when it comes to energy production, but also that money can be spent wisely on a number of different activities.
Thank you. Going back to the other two, just the other two of you very quickly. We have had witnesses come in here and testify and say that if we stop producing energy domestically, that all that's going to happen is we're going to become more dependent upon energy from other countries. Do either of you dispute that? Mr. Williams or Dr. Shankoff?
Am I on? I think that if we move to expand renewable energy, actually that is in our national security interest, and that we should be doing that aggressively.
I'm not sure that answered the question, but are you saying we should stop producing oil and gas domestically?
What I'm saying is we should thoughtfully transition from fossil fuel production to renewable energy and a clean energy economy of the future, and that if we do it in a smart and right way, that'll keep we can grow the economy while we do it and increase our national security.
Dr. Shankoff?
I would agree with Mr. Williams. I believe that stopping fossil fuel development in the United States tomorrow would certainly increase imports since our economies are not set up.
What about next week? I'm kidding, don't answer me. Just ignore me like these guys.
What I believe is that we need to have a managed decline. I believe that we need to immediately start controlling greenhouse gas emissions from our fossil energy systems. I believe that we need to concurrently ramp up renewable and low-emitting energy sources. And if we do that carefully, we will be growing our economy, protecting jobs, and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, hopefully down to near zero in the not-too-distant future.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you know, if we don't do this carefully, we're going to end up with situations like we just saw in New York and Massachusetts where they're importing Russian gas because they aren't being thoughtful about carrying this out. But I want to thank
But
you
it's
very much.
also, as he pointed out, we also have to look at those New England states for having the greatest production of offshore wind that the country has ever seen.
That's right,
So-
and the greatest cost of energy. That's correct.
So I think the Europeans have demonstrated how they have brought down the cost of offshore wind. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here, the members of the committee. That brings our hearing to a close. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We're going to ask you to respond in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, it was fun.